Good evening, everybody. We've been going through a series that comes from a passage in the book of Hebrews, and we've just been focusing on various books in the Bible in light of what this passage says. That's Hebrews 12, verse 1 to 2. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. So let's just keep that in mind as we go through the book of Esther. Just to give us a little bit of historical perspective, in the time of Esther, so in 1856 BC, the Babylonian Empire conquered the kingdom of Judah and forcibly relocated a significant portion of the Jewish nation to Babylon. 47 years later, the Persian Empire conquered Babylonia, and the Cyrus Edict was passed allowing Jews to return to and to build Jerusalem anew. Mordecai and his adopted daughter Esther remained in Persia, which is modern-day Iran. The book of Esther has no direct reference to God, but through the characters' actions and the events that took place, we can see God's sovereign hand at work through acts of faith and through what seem to be happy coincidences, but are actually God at work. Much of the sovereignty of God in the book of Esther can be expressed in the words of Joseph in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And also as expressed by Paul in his letter to the Romans, we know that for all those who love God, all good things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So we find God through the character and faith of Esther. Esther is forcibly taken into King Xerxes' harem after Queen Vashti defies the king and is stripped of her position. This was likely a terrifying and humiliating situation for a young Jewish woman. But Esther perseveres in faith, and she likely remembers the words of Jeremiah the prophet and the wisdom derived from it, from Jeremiah 29, verse 5 to 7, which she perhaps heard read to her by her father Mordecai. If you'd like to just pause for a moment and go through those verses, it's Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 5 to 7. So rather than fight, Esther chooses to cooperate, and she wins favor in the eyes of King Xerxes, gaining her a place of influence and power. She likely also learned much from listening to the story of Joseph while she was growing up, and as her time in the harem was very similar to Joseph's when he was in captivity under the slave master and under that of the Pharaoh, she likely learned how to deal with many of those situations. Mordecai was also clearly familiar with the words spoken by God through Jeremiah, as he unveiled a plot against King Xerxes and reported it to Esther, thereby foiling it. This plot was one that was put in place by two of the king's servants, and they were planning to assassinate the king. This plot and Mordecai's place in preventing it was recorded in the history books of Persia in the presence of King Xerxes. This was both a wise and a faithful act by Mordecai, and was likely to have been led by God. After all, Xerxes was an arrogant, corrupt, and proud ruler. There was no reason for Mordecai to want to keep him alive. But as we can now read in Romans chapter 13, in regard to the positions of those in governing authority, it says, Do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for good. Much would otherwise have hindered Esther and Mordecai's faith had they not known the scriptures, and kept their eyes firmly fixed upon God and what he had said was good and right. But sin is at work in the hearts of man. King Xerxes promoted Haman to the position of highest authority. Against the king's edict, Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman, likely because he feels that it is too close to idolatry and is familiar with Exodus and the Ten Commandments. You shall have no gods before me, and you shall not bow down to them. This infuriates Haman, who plots not only to kill Mordecai, but bribes King Xerxes to write an edict for the ethnic cleansing of the Jews living in Persia. Haman also plans to execute Mordecai outside his home on a scaffold. However, we see God's subtle hand at work when King Xerxes is kept from sleep, and the history books are read to him. He is reminded of Mordecai's part in preventing the king's assassination, which leads to the humorous event where Haman is forced to honor Mordecai by parading him through the streets, an honor which he expected to have lavished on himself. When Mordecai learns of Haman's plot to wipe out the Jews, he is distressed and goes into a period of great mourning. Esther, unaware of Haman's evil scheme, is concerned for her father and asks one of her attendants to find out what is troubling him. When, through her servant, she is told of Haman's decree, she knows that it is her moral duty to plead with the king for the lives of her people. However, she fears for her own life, for if she were to go to Xerxes without an invitation, she might die. Mordecai responds to her fears with an amazing display of faith, warning her that she too will be killed if she does not take action, and also stating, "If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" There is a possibility that Mordecai knows of and believes that God has promised to send his Messiah, and Mordecai has faith that God will deliver his people through him if Esther does not step up. Mordecai also believes that God accomplishes his purposes through partnership with his people and knows that Esther, like each of us, has a role to play in this. The story of Esther goes on to tell how Esther finds courage through communal prayer and fasting, and finally confronts Haman in the presence of the king. Haman is executed, and the decree to wipe out all the Jews is reversed, giving them the power under the authority of King Xerxes, and through the persistent petitions by Esther, to completely destroy all those who would have slaughtered their people. Many others even turned to the faith out of the fear of God's people. So, what have we learned? We learned that Esther threw off her ill treatment at the hands of King Xerxes and his royal court by submitting to her captivity rather than resisting it. She was not entangled by the sin that might have come through gaining royal power and riches, but rather she remembered her lowly father and fought against the evil plight of God's people. And we learned that Mordecai persevered through oppression and grave danger, encouraging his daughter and bringing her up in the wisdom of the Lord, with eyes firmly fixed on God's promises and the hope that the coming Messiah, Jesus, would be here soon. So, what does this all mean for us? It means that we can live faithful lives in a world where those in authority are not living under God's rule. Instead of fighting against them, we can live godly lives that influence the world. After all, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. It means that, like Mordecai, we can bring up our children to know God's word, so that when God is silent, like Esther, our children can hear his wisdom and know the path set out for them through the scriptures. And in the face of overwhelming evil and corruption, we can throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, because, like Mordecai, we can run the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on the coming Messiah, Jesus. Thank you all. Have a good night.